You are listening to Faithless Brewing, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the Spike Road. Each week we design new decks for tournament play. We put our creations to the test and share our findings on the air. Today we take a look at 7 of the most important innovations in Modern, from Velomachus turns, expressive iteration in Jeskai control, and a new way to build Enchantress. All of that and more is coming up on this edition of the Faithless Brewing Podcast. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the Faithless Brewing Podcast. I am your host, Dan Schriever, coming to you from Durham, North Carolina, and I am joined today by my guy on the West Coast. He is Damon Alexander. Damon, what's up?
Hey, just got a sunny day in Seattle, and I've been gearing up for an expedition into the Olympics.
Oh, big trip coming up.
Yeah, hoping to make 50 miles of kind of a mini loop into the interior, and it gets pretty remote. You're quite far from a car at some point.
How far are we talking here?
About 20-ish miles at the most, including like a mountain pass.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, and it's over a potentially tricky trail. I've heard there's like some trees that blew down over the winter and spring. And so you have to, sometimes it's easy to get around them. Sometimes you have to really do a little dance or something to find a way across.
So this may be the last time that we talk to you, is what I'm hearing.
It's certainly possible, but if so, please keep me in your thoughts.
This is actually turning out to be a really special episode. This is Damon's final episode on the Faithless Brewing Podcast before he's eaten by a bear.
No, I've got a bear can. It's fine. It's fine. I'm more about goats than bears.
Jeez. 1-1 mountain walk. Gotta watch out for that. No David Robertson today. This will be just Damon and myself. On the agenda today, we are going to be talking mainly about Modern, as well as some other goings-on in the Magic world. In our Sunday episode, although David cannot join us this week, he will be with us in spirit as he's got some sweet lists that he's brewed up. We'll be talking about one of the new class cards from Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, Bard class, one that's been making a bit of noise in Pioneer. We've got a few lists for that card in both formats, both Pioneer and Modern. And I think that should be a pretty interesting episode. You'll want to check back on Sunday for that. But before we get to all that, we got to check in on what else is happening in the Modern metagame. And as is our wont, got to start off with a little bit of housekeeping. Just a quick reminder to anyone listening that if you would like to support the cast, if you like what we do, want to chip in, you can do so by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/faithlessbrewing, where you can make a pledge. It can be as little as $1 a week. Even that goes a tremendous way towards helping us pay our server fees, pay for editing, keep this ad-free, and we really appreciate it. You also get some cool rewards as a benefit for joining. You get access to our Faithless Brewing Discord. We're always working on some sweet new stuff. There's a ton of great ideas being thrown around. You can even hear episodes early. We are, in fact, recording this week live in our Discord channel as well.
Of course, we're competing with the NBA Finals, so any listeners who are big fans, I'm sure, are watching that game.
All right, Damon, what's going on in Modern? Talk to me.
Well, we have the biggest news item. Of course, by Friday, as this episode releases, we will know for sure whether the WotC website that has been set up for a BNR update tomorrow, July 21st, bears... I don't know if fruit is the right word, but seeds of a new metagame.
So you're not seriously expecting a ban in Modern or Pioneer, right? Fill me in here. So for those who are like not deeply involved in all the rumor mills and the latest trends, what are you talking about?
Yeah, so apparently there's a pattern that before a BNR update, Wizard sets up a URL that looks like, magic.wizards.com/articles, archive, news, July 21st, 2021, banned and restricted announcements. And as you can guess, all the changes as they have different announcements, it doesn't say, the Luris edition or whatever. It's just July 21st, 2021. So you can go to your browser, right now and try July 21st or July 22nd or July 23rd. You could even then write a little scraper that automatically every day wakes up and tries every possible date over the next 2 months. And so I think some people have done this. And every so often, instead of getting like a standard response of like website not found, now you get a website saying you are not authorized to access this page. And so I guess this has been historically been used as a predictor of BNR. I'm not actually sure. I don't have the data on like the accuracy of this method, but it's getting some hype.
All right, so what are the rumors? I've heard Pauper, apparently the Chatterstorm Galvanic Storm deck is just super oppressive in that format. Last week there was a Commander ban. You guys talked about the Hullbreacher ban, and I think after you recorded, there was even a ban in Future Standard, if that's possible. Book of Exalted Deeds was banned. So it could be any format, basically.
Yeah, I really don't know. I mean, Chatterstorm, as somebody who does not play Pauper, seems like it makes sense from what I hear, is that it's dominating the format. On the other hand, maybe Mishra's Bauble or whatever, who knows? Sometimes we get surprised.
Yeah, for whatever reason, the Splinter Twin chatter, it's not Chatterstorm, but the chatter of Splinter Twin on banning talk, you can just stir that pot, every couple of months and get a huge response. And I don't know why. Maybe it was because of this BNR scraper detective sleuthing. A lot of people were talking about Splinter Twin earlier this week. Aspiring Spike, Saffron Olive, talking about how for the first time in years, the metagame in Modern is so fast, so efficient that the particular combo presented by Tempo Turn 4 Twin or a combo control deck is not going to be too oppressive, and it will be fine to reintroduce Twin to the format. I can't even tell if they're trolling us at this point with comments like that.
There are definitely a lot of people out there that love Splinter Twin, just as I used to love Stoneforge Mystic in Legacy and was happy to see it come to Modern. That said, yeah, it's an interesting argument they make that perhaps Twin was, we agree that Twin was too good for Modern when it got banned, but the power level of Modern, every 6 months we say things like the power level of Modern has never been higher, and it's always true that this is the nature of power creep. MH2 was a quantum step forward in speed and reliability. So maybe you play Splinter Twin, your opponent has Asmora with 8 food, and so you shoot your Deceiver Exarch, sign the match slip, and you go your next round in the 0-1 bracket.
It was my understanding that not everyone agreed that Splinter Twin was too good for Modern, and that a lot of the Splinter Twin truthers feel like it was unfairly targeted years ago for the diversity ban or whatever the reason given was. And this is something that David always harps on too. He says, if you love Splinter Twin so much, you can just play Kiki-Jiki. It's the exact same deck.
Well, it's not the exact same deck. Let's be real. It has a very similar, almost identical AB combo of Kiki-Jiki plus Pestermite or Deceiver Exarch that makes infinite attackers and then attacks for lethal. But beyond that, like the way it plays out, the ability for the Kiki-Jiki deck to win through even a Lightning Bolt is much lower. The ability to just win on turn 4, it obviously can't do that anymore unless you have some weird, like ramp Kiki-Jiki deck. The way the Kiki decks that work are built is they don't look the same. They don't play 4 Kiki-Jikis. That is a great way to lose a lot of games of Magic. But the Splinter Twin decks are very much built around being able to reliably combo pretty early and having the right pieces to delay the game and suppress your opponent's game plan until you reach that state. With interesting morphs post-side, I'm not going to claim the deck is like super one-dimensional or anything, but the Kiki-Jiki decks are not the same any more than, Heliod Ballista is the same thing.
So that's evidence in favor of the idea that it's just a power level thing. The slight boost or major boost in power that you're describing by having the exact card Splinter Twin available is what pushes that deck over the edge. So we're not wrong to be like constantly evaluating the power level of Modern to check whether Splinter Twin is safe or not. That's fine.
Yeah. And there's questions in terms of both power level. Maybe Splinter Twin doesn't even make the top 32 of a challenge these days. And also like the fun level, which is to some extent related. If nobody's playing the decks, it sucks. It doesn't really matter if it's not fun to play against. But it's kind of like when you're playing a deck with like an answer to Rhinos or Living End or whatever, and you're so ready to counter it, and they go ice your land, and now you can't stop it.
I find that so incredibly tilting. I don't know why that line in particular like really upsets me. It happens all the time.
Yeah, well, Splinter Twin is based around that line because they play 8 game pieces that ice your land.
Yeah. All right. Well, I wasn't really planning to talk about Splinter Twin, but it's an interesting segue to kind of the meat of this episode. So what I have in mind for us is to sort of look at the latest developments in Modern. We're about 5-6 weeks into Modern Horizons 2 season now, and we're seeing that there is, on the one hand, some churn among the top tier decks, but on the other hand, there are also tweaks and refinements being made to the known top strategies, and a handful of new strategies popping up here and there in the challenges as well. These are the decks that this Splinter Twin would be battling against. It's interesting. Like the first deck I have here to talk about, Velomachus, would be totally hosed if there were a bunch of Deceiver Exarchs being played in main decks.
Yeah. Although this deck is weirdly enough Splinter Twin-esque in its own right with how the games play out. It's playing kind of a similar shell to kind of try to delay the opponent with the Teferis and some removal. Not quite as much as a twin deck can get to, although Zan Syed had an interesting variation on this we'll get to in a second. But once you get Velomachus on the battlefield, you don't need to cast another spell to give it, you don't need Splinter Twin. Velomachus alone wins the game. Pretty good regularity. And so in that sense, like, or even honestly, like a Teferi plus a Wrenn and 6 plus you just drew a few Time Warps, and all of a sudden your Wrenn and 6 gets ultimate and you win the game from the being able to retrace your Time Warps. So the deck just kind of wins in a combo-ish way, pretty reliably, pretty quickly, in a way that really doesn't care too much about what the opponent's doing, as long as they're not killing your Velomachus. But again, that's what your Teferi Time Ravelers are for. So you can't cast your Deceiver Exarch. There's a Teferi on the battlefield.
I think for listeners, people will either be extremely familiar with the Velomachus deck, or they will have not heard of it at all. And I think it ties directly to how closely have you been following Modern for the last 6 weeks or so. The deck has been around since Strixhaven released, but it's really come into its own. I think probably every week for the past 4 weeks, I've been like, maybe we should talk about Velomachus. It did well in the challenges. Next week, maybe we should feature Velomachus this week. It did so well in the challenges. And again, this weekend, finally, I'm just like, all right, we're going to talk about this deck first because it put up huge numbers in the challenges. It's no longer just a niche deck. I think the first build might have been built by a streamer named Freak You Nasty. I'm not 100% sure about that, but friend of the podcast, Mana Symbol, Zach Ryle, was on this deck immediately, and I think he did a tremendous amount of work to popularize it. He put up a bunch of challenge results, and it just has taken off. I think the more people see it, pick it up, the more they keep winning, and I'll frequently find tweets being like, I took my take on Velomachus to top 8 or top whatever in the challenge. And I look at the list and it's like pretty much the same list it's always been, with like just a couple tweaks. And I want to call them refinements because I think they're finally starting to like get to the core of like what is known about the deck and what is still unknown. So Damon, like, what do we know about like which cards are locked in this deck and which cards are still up in the air?
Well, my answer for that would be a little bit different if not for seeing what happened when Zan Syed played this list. He took a kind of a stock list. I know he was playing this in his like modern late night streams. Then he played in the challenge to a good finish with a pretty different looking version on the same theme. But let's come back to that one. The core of this deck, the common shell, is the 2 Velomachus. That's just you have to have those. That's what the deck is built around. The 4 Indomitable Creativity to get a Velomachus into play, and then the 4 Dwarven Mine mana base, which means that every land has to be a mountain, except for there's a single basic island. Then from there, you need to have a pile of cards that win the game with Velomachus, and those cards in this case are Time Warps. So we have 4 Time Warp, 4 Savor the Moment. You can't really lower the density of these that much because otherwise your Velomachus will just like hit a lightning bolt, you fizzle out, and your opponent kills you or whatever next turn. So you do need to have that many of them. And then from there we start to get more into the Planeswalker side, which aren't fundamental to the strategy, but are so good for it that I think that they're locked. Namely, the 4 Wrenn and 6, the 4 Teferis. The Wrenn and 6s guarantee you keep hitting your land drops, which let you get more and more dwarfs on the battlefield. If your first dwarf gets bolted or whatever, you just get back another fetch land, make another dwarf. Teferi protects the whole combo while it's in action, slows down the opponent. Whatever Teferi does so well, he's really doing a good job in this deck. And then Wrenn and 6 kind of does double duty as this card that gives you steady value as you cast Time Warps that you just happen to draw naturally. So then we get to the kind of the flex slots, which I guess are the 4 Prismari Command, the 4 Prismatic Ending, the 4 Bolt, and the 2 Hard Evidence. This is coming off of Mr. Rayeb, who's had a streak of top finishes with the deck. And I think we're putting together some sort of write-up on it. But that means that the flex slots are basically the interactive pieces, and its hard evidence is a really fun one. It's kind of like the blue Thraben Inspector, but it actually kind of does double duty in this deck because you can't really play actual Thraben Inspector because then you would, creativity into it and be, go home and be sad. But hard evidence provides you both two things that you can cast creativity on, both a clue and a crab. And the crab does its best Arboreal Grazer impression as it blocks Ragavans for days.
Yeah, weirdly well-positioned. A 0/3 for 1 that eventually replaces itself. Hard evidence is a common that I guess supports the blue-green draft archetype in Modern Horizons 2, which is built around getting a diverse range of token types in play. Turns out Indomitable Creativity is very interested in having a diverse amount of tokens in play. One of the most common things you'll see out of the Velomachus deck is that they'll wait until they have 2 targets for Indomitable Creativity. That way, if your opponent is sitting on a lightning bolt, planning to lightning bolt your Dwarven Mind token in response to creativity for 1, you can get around that by just waiting until you have 2 Dwarven Minds and then do creativity for 2. Hard evidence just makes it even easier to assemble like multiple targets for creativity.
Yeah, and the card does all this while being quite a beautiful foil. I picked up one of these. They're still pretty cheap. But the way the foiling, there's like this moon in the background with the clouds encroaching as this, evening over a beach with a crab, and like the gold ring that we're investigating has a nice shine to it. Nice art.
Yes. Damon Finance at it again. Get your hard evidence foils before the spike. So yeah, it's interesting to see like a card like that, which it's gotta be considered a flex slot, right? It's just a 2-of here. It's not crucial to the strategy, but they're saying this is better than cards like Jace the Mind Sculptor, which used to be 1 or 2 of in the list. Remand used to be a 4 of in the list. Now it's down to like 1 or 0 copies, and instead you're maxing out on your actual removal, prismatic endings, lightning bolts. And I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, you've heard me. I don't hate to say it. I love to say it. I hate Jace the Mind Sculptor. How many times I've been saying Remand and Jace are like not very good, and finally these Velomachus decks are proving my theory correct.
Yeah, it also just depends. I mean, clearly on the meta. Right now, we're seeing a ton of decks playing very cheap spells. So you're going to Remand a 1-drop. That doesn't feel great. You have the 4 Teferis to bounce a Murktide Regent if you ever have to. So you have at least some answers to those. But the Remands otherwise aren't super well positioned right now. If you were in a meta that had a lot of infinite life combo, like the Collected Company Heliod Spike Feeder list, which can also kill you with Walking Ballista, but they usually play more Spike Feeders. They get infinite life usually before they get the infinite damage combo. You would want to Jace the Mind Sculptor for that kind of matchup. You may be able to get infinite turns, but infinite turns does not beat infinite life. In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah, so it's like a very narrow card. Just saying.
Jace the Mind Sculptor? I would say Jace the Mind Sculptor is like I mean, I hope this isn't too controversial. Jace the Mind Sculptor is a more powerful Magic card than Hard Evidence.
I mean, the evidence suggests that it's not more powerful. It's getting vastly outperformed by Hard Evidence in the latest trend. If these trends continue, you'll be able to trade your Hard Evidence foil for a Jace the Mind Sculptor foil straight up, no problem.
All right, Dan. Well, I have a Hard Evidence right here waiting. So you want to mail me your Jace? I'll mail you a Hard Evidence. I will make that deal all day long with you.
Let's take a look at this variant build, which also does not contain Jace the Mind Sculptor, I might add.
Yeah, so Zan Syed got, I believe, 18th in the challenge with a very similar core shell, but with a major change. Namely, there's no Velomachus, there's no Time Warps. So what this deck is it's going back to the days of why don't we just get an Emrakul as our best creativity target. That used to be the cool thing to do. Those lists would sometimes play through the breach, sometimes not. So this list just goes back to that and says, I want to cast creativity on a dwarf and get Emrakul. And my Teferis and Renin 6s will run interference. He's playing 4 Hard Evidence for even more things that can both delay and get earlier creativities off. Because you don't have so many Time Warps, the deck gets to play a lot more interaction. In this case, these are 3 delays, 2 Remands, and 2 Nahiri the Harbingers. And Nahiri is also nice because she herself can get an Emrakul into play as her ultimate is kind of like a Through the Breach. So interesting to see a seasoned SCG grinder take this list, try it out, and make a major tweak and do well with it.
Would you say that the thought process here is that Zan is maybe thinking maybe the strength of the Velomachus deck is not actually the Velomachus package itself. Like if you're not eager to be drawing Time Warps and savor the moments, you have basically a 10 card package of 2 Velomachus and 8 Time Warps. What if you can just get a much more compact win condition with Indomitable Creativity and a single Emrakul? If Indomitable Creativity is what makes that deck powerful and the Planeswalkers make it powerful, forget the Velomachus and just leave more room for interaction.
Yeah. I think it is definitely a meta call in the sense that Emrakul does have weaknesses. For example, if your opponent has a Teferi the Time Raveler, they can bounce your Emrakul. Velomachus coming down with haste can, I guess, also get screwed up by Teferi, but not as badly.
It's interesting because a lot of the cards that can snipe a Velomachus are similar to the cards that can take down a Murktide Regent. So it's like the more people tech out against Murktide Regent, the more Velomachus is less of a guaranteed thing. Murktide Regent can survive Unholy Heat. Velomachus usually can't, so if you don't have Teferi protection, it might be vulnerable there. But even things like Seal of Removal or whatever, who knows? It's like random cards that happen to kill any flyer. Terminate is being played more.
Yeah, Aether Spellbomb or whatever. I guess Aether Spellbomb is also good against Emrakul.
Oh, yeah, I suppose so.
But yeah, Emrakul is certainly a much sturdier creature. And the thing is, yeah, like the Time Warps are usually not bad. They cycle, they're fine. If you draw a bunch of Time Warps, it usually isn't the end of the world unless you die very quickly. The Save for the Moments are, in fact, pretty bad. They are just a worse Explorer in most situations, unless you're playing a Fires of Invention deck, which this is not. And so, yeah, this deck gets to play, I guess, kind of 5 fewer dead slots in terms of bad top decks. And I guess it puts them all into 3 delay, 2 remand.
What do you make of the delays here?
It's definitely a techie choice. Obviously, if you have a Teferi Time Raveler, the card improves dramatically. And by obviously, I mean, it's not obvious. But delay gives your opponent, it counters a spell, and then it goes on suspend for a few turns with 3 time counters. And then if you have a Teferi in play as the last suspend counter comes off, Teferi hoses the mechanic. You cannot cast a spell during your upkeep with the Teferi static active. And so delay becomes this better version of a counterspell. The card just kind of stays in exile forever. Or alternatively, your opponent resolves the spell coming off suspend after they've taken 15 from Emrakul and have no other permanents on the battlefield.
I think if you had asked me a month and a half ago whether we'd ever see a card like Delay again, the answer would have been no, because Counterspell was returning to the format, and so all of these miscellaneous cards whose ceiling is a counterspell but whose floor is worse than counterspell, like Mana Leak being a key example, Logic Knot, those would all be replaced, right, by just the real deal. Why not just play counterspells instead? But the truth of it is blue is a huge deck building cost, especially in a deck like this that's looking to play mountains for the first 4 or 5 turns of the game. So yeah, it turns out there's still room for very niche cards that only cost a single blue mana to find their homes, and I think that's good. That's good for the format. That gives me some hope, some cause for optimism.
Yeah, and the thing with delay is that before the spell gets off suspend, it actually is better than counterspell against cards that benefit from being in the graveyard. With delay, they're just in exile, and so whether those are cards, powering up Delirium or whatever, because you countered a key type, or your opponent is going to K-command something back and now they can't, or it's like a card like Kroxa, which naturally comes back. The thing with this deck is not really meant to take games long. It just doesn't really have the tools to stabilize a board over a long game. So to some extent, you're banking on pretty reliably getting your Emrakul onto the battlefield pretty fast, which I think is maybe one downside of this deck, where the deck that does all these Time Warps just gets a Wrenn and 6 and then runs interference on the Wrenn and 6, and all of a sudden they're casting Time Warps as they draw into, hopefully, the creativity. This deck is a little bit less of that kind of line available. They have to lean more into their crabs, I guess, to hold the fort.
Yeah, I think Velomachus players win a large percentage of their games just by ultimating a Wrenn and 6 ahead of schedule, thanks to a Time Warp, and then the Wrenn and 6 ultimate, the best card you can cast off of that is often a Time Warp. So that becomes like a whole other win condition that comes up much more frequently than just, Wrenn and 6 ultimate recast Lightning Bolts, which is what this non-Time Warp list can do.
Yeah. One interesting thing about both these lists, actually, even more the pure Velomachus list, is that this is kind of a Splinter Twin list. It plays a bunch of interaction, in this case maybe not too much, and then you tap out in turn, your turn 3, their turn 4, they untap, they go infinite.
One card Splinter Twin. Indomitable creativity plus lands.
Right. Of course, you have to play these cards like, the Time Warps in your deck. So it's not truly a kind of a one card Splinter Twin. It requires some support. But I think it's kind of a similar deck building constraint to a Splinter Twin list where you just have to play, your 4 Deceiver Exarch, 3 Pestermite or whatever.
Interesting. So, as I said, this deck is popping off. It's showing up more and more in the challenges. You'll run into it, not every league, not even every few leagues, but if you see an opponent playing a lot of fetch lands and triumphs and not necessarily doing anything in the first few turns, just put them on Velomachus or this creativity non-Velomachus version that Damon has highlighted here. Bring in your Blood Moons. That seems to be the most effective card at shutting down the core of their mana engine, and just hope that they don't sneak out a Nahiri and backdoor you that way.
Yeah, apparently these lists sideboard a basic planes in preparation for Blood Moon.
Yeah, I mean, it's like kind of desperate straits. You have to play all these fetches and so many shocks just to meet the mountain quota. They do bring in Ethergust to try to have some counterplay. You only need one good turn to get Velomachus in play or Emrakul in play, but it becomes a tall order when you just have to keep the Blood Moon off the table forever. Anyway, enough about those decks for now. It's been however many minutes. We haven't even talked about Ragavan for a while. So what's happening with the dreaded Modern Horizons 2 cards?
Yeah, Ragavan is up to 150 ticks.
Yeah.
I am not prepared to offer a Damon Finest recommendation on when to purchase Ragavans.
Part of the issue was that Modern Horizons 2 drafts briefly ended on Magic Online after only a month, because the way the timing works out with Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms coming out, they retired Modern Horizons 2 to get people to play Dungeons and Dragons again. That means that the supply of these MH2 cards has been cut off. Now, I think as of today, there was a re-announcement saying, okay, we'll bring back MH2 drafts for a little while longer, but that's just delaying the inevitable. These cards are going to be extremely expensive. Seeing Ragavan jump from 105 to 150 in the span of a couple days was very alarming. Cards like Urza's Saga, cards like Endurance were up above 60 at the same time.
Yeah. The thing is, even with the drafts, the payout structure of the actual leagues versus the Phantom leagues isn't usually that favorable. And the MH2 distribution and value has become so skewed. When it came out, it was oh my goodness, I should save these Rashawn Dockhands I opened from the box I bought. This is an expensive booster, so it's kind of a core base price. This could be the next season Pyromancer. It could be $40 in a year played as a tier 1 4 of in a bunch of decks. And the card's sitting at 75 cents. There just isn't room for these rares that aren't extremely good like Urza's Saga to be worth anything. Yeah,
absolutely. And on Magic Online, that value, for whatever reason, is tied up in those 3 cards I just mentioned, Endurance, Urza's Saga, and Ragavan. The rest of the set is sort of affordable, and I'm wondering if it makes sense if you're not going to use a rental service, or if you're afraid of other cards becoming extremely, extremely unaffordable, such that you can't rent your decks anymore because they cost so much. It's not out of the question to just buy the rest of the set of Modern Horizons 2 on Magic Online just in case.
Oh, it was an investment?
Not as an investment, but just as a hedge against, a card like Murktide Regent or Solitude or something, just randomly climbing up and up and up. If you can have them now for 20 or 25, why not just get them now before they're at 60 or 70 in a couple months?
Yeah, this is kind of, I think, the classic MTG finance question of when should I buy card X? And it actually is quite analogous to the stock market. When should I buy, stock X, and when should I sell it? Being kind of, I guess, the fundamental decision of investment. And of course, in finance, the answer is very easy. You should just buy index funds. Namely, you should just buy a Vanguard Total Stock Market. The ticker is VTSAX. I would recommend that to everybody. There's more to it than that, so don't take that just as a single investment thing. But with Magic, there's definitely different dynamics. It's not an efficient market. It's not as predictable a market. Ragavan doesn't yield you dividends, but it yields you gameplay, excitement. You get to play with the card you own versus the dividends that a stock yields or whatever. And there's this curve for when is the right time to buy a card that was just released. And the card prices typically go down and then they go back up. And then maybe they go down as it gets reprinted. Or banned is a relevant topic on some of these cards. The thing is that Solitude, it's one of those cards that's mid-priced right now, right? And it could double. It could be like MH1's Seasoned Pyromancer or Hex Drinker, where it was pretty cheap for a while, and then it just went up by a lot. Or it could kind of just sit at that price for a long time. So my personal philosophy is, in general, just buy cards that you want to play with imminently. Don't buy cards you don't, unless you are willing to do these sort of willing to lose money, basically. MTG Finance is enjoyable in part because the stakes are not quite as large as gambling in, like with boats or stocks or anything like that. I mean, you could do stocks for pretty cheap if you want, but it scales up too well to be your kind of overall, retirement portfolio, not where you want to play games.
So we did get a little bit of Damon Finance in, and some real life Damon Finance. A little bonus section. Get those Vanguard index funds. Why do I mention Ragavan and Urza Saga together? Well, these two cards had to come together sooner or later. We talked about Urza Saga being one pole of like the power of MH2 was tied up in the Saga decks with Asmora Namardika Jason Kuldakar, and that shifted from like the green-black versions to blue-black versions with Urza. On the other side of the coin, Dragon's Rage Channeler and Ragavan were spawning a huge renaissance in red anything decks. We did briefly see like blue-red Urza Saga with some Ragavans. Now it seems to be like coming crashing finally together in a list that made top 8 in the challenge from Spider Space. How would you describe this build, Damon?
I've heard it is like black-red good cards or whatever. Which can't quite be right because I refuse to believe that Ovalchase Daredevil is actually a good Magic card. Obviously, it plays a critical role in Modern right now. But yeah, also maybe just like MH2 soup. This list plays 4 Asmora, 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler, 4 Ragavan, 2 Bone Shards, 4 Underworld Cookbook, 4 Saga, and then we could just lump in the Ovalchase Daredevil as an MH2 card. Nobody was playing this card before the set released.
Yeah, Kroxa here is a 2 of. That's one of the worst cards in the deck, according to Spider Space. You got your Lightning Bolts, your Mishra's Baubles. You have your 1 Shadow Spear for the Saga to find. 3 Seasoned Pyromancer. Holdover from MH1. I guess this is taking the Urza slot. So, have we like reached the final form yet? Or what's going on here? Is this deck doing something better than the previous versions of either the Kitchen decks or the Dragon's Rage Channeler Ragavan decks?
Yeah, my belief in the meta is that the best Urza Saga deck is Hammer Time, and the best Dragon Rage Channeler deck is Blue-Red Murktide, and the best Asmora Cookbook deck is either nobody knows or it just exists but isn't as good as those other 2 decks. Asmora does show up in the challenges and good results, and you see it in League sometimes, but not the same way that you see these other decks at the same level. And so, Doomwake played a different Asmora deck, and you see other Asmora decks do well occasionally. But I don't think that, the final form of it, like it could just be that because it isn't a true tier 1 deck, there is no final form. You want to play Urza with Asmora, you can do that. You kind of play a lot of different cards with it. Ragavan makes treasures, which pumps up your constructs. They were made to go together.
All right, so there's no cause to panic for this particular build. Obviously, it's too early to say whether this is going to become like the most popular build. I think people just like can't rent Ragavans anymore, so there's less representation of this deck than there could be in the leagues. The leagues are very diverse. They're very fun.
Yeah. You do give up Lurrus to play the Ovalchase Daredevils and Street Race to enable Asmora. You don't get to play everybody's favorite companion.
And that's become somehow one of the most meaningful choices in Modern. A little bit sad to say it, but that's just where it is. You don't see as many Seasoned Pyromancers as you used to.
Yeah, who knew that, 4 years ago that one of our biggest deck building decisions would be a card that isn't even in your main deck and not really part of your sideboard either. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think about these Asmora shells, Dan?
Well, the thing that I find challenging when playing against a Dragon's Rage Channeler Ragavan deck is that you have to be prepared for the starts that lead on one of those creatures on turn 1. And you also have to prepare for the starts that don't play either of them until turn 3 or 4 and are just like interacting and setting up. So like that is already posing like a big problem for just like the rest of the formats. Like, do you load up on spot removal just to protect yourself from the early red 1-drop? And if so, like, are you vulnerable to something else? You're not going to die to Serum Visions if they just like kept a hand that didn't have Dragon's Rage Channeler, but you might die to Urza Saga Cookbook Asmora if you were keeping a hand that was just like full of anti-Regavan cards. So in that sense, like, I haven't really thought through like which interaction lines up against both the Regavan DRC angle and the kitchen angle. If there's overlap.
It was funny. Doomike was like on stream and he was playing like this deck. He tried like his Urza deck and he kept losing to Hammer Time. So he just developed to build like a version of his Asmora deck that just beats Hammer Time. Played a league. I think he went 4-1. His one loss was to Hammer Time. It is brutal. Like that deck is so good. So first off, they have their own Urza Saga and their constructs are just as large or larger than yours. Their Urza Saga also can get Piling Needle to shut off your Asmora, which is perhaps one of your best interactive pieces that can kind of continually gun down their creatures. Your Saga can find a Piling Needle coming out of the side, but it doesn't really stop Colossus Hammer because of Sigarda's aid. And then meanwhile, they play Sanctifier on Vec, which just absolutely crushes their chance of getting Delirium, blocks Ragavan forever, makes Ovalchase Daredevil not actually do anything. Hammer Time just smoked these decks.
I was hoping you're going to reveal the tech to beat Hammer Time at the end of that, but I guess there isn't any. I've been getting smoked by Hammer Time repeatedly for like a month now, and I cannot find any good sideboard cards against it. It's possible there just aren't any. I have not seen any discussions where people volunteered a bunch of good answers for Hammer Time, besides just like killing them first.
Yeah, which is not as easy as it sounds. I mean, this deck is extremely good. I mean, you could make an argument that it is actually a tier 0 deck right now. The people who aren't are spewing equity or whatever. The deck is extremely fast. It's extremely efficient. It's extremely resilient and has as many 2-for-1s as a control deck. Of course, maybe the person to ask for how to beat this deck is Gabriel Nassif, who won with Jeskai Bad Control, or Awful Control, I think he called it.
Let's take a look at that list. So this was the Sunday challenge. I believe he's still calling it Awful Jeskai, even though he won the challenge and 5-0'd a couple more times with it. I think on Twitter he says maybe not as bad as he thought, but when I look at the list, it looks hideous. This deck looks extremely bad, and I cannot explain why this deck functions. Some of the cards in it, well, it's in Jeskai colors, it's Jeskai control, and if you're a longtime Modern fan, you might be expecting, I don't know, some Snapcaster Mages, some Ops or Serum Visions, some Path to Exiles, maybe a Wrath, maybe some Teferis or something. Some of those cards are here. There's actually 3 Supreme Verdicts, and there are some Planeswalkers. There's 1 big Teferi, 3 small Teferis, and a Jace, the Mind Sculptor. Beyond that, it's like a completely incoherent collection of spot removal and sorcery-based value cards. So Prismatic Ending and Lightning Bolts, full set of 8 of those. Then you get to Wall of Omens as a 3 of, Rest in Peace main deck as a 2 of, Shark Typhoon as a 4 of, 1 Solitude, 1 Path to Exile, 1 Counterspell, 4 Expressive Iteration, 2 Fire Ice, 1 Lightning Helix, 3 Supreme Verdict, 1 Engineered Explosives. Help me make sense of this. What is the overarching philosophy that like stitches this all together?
I think the main philosophy is that Rest in Peace is well positioned right now in its challenge. It just completely shuts down a lot of angles that can cripple a lot of decks out there. And that the traditional control deck is weirder than it's ever been. 4 Expressive Iteration, that's such a strange card to see in a control deck. As a result, you can't play that many counter spells. This deck has a lot more burn. It has a single counter spell.
Right. Can we even say counter spells plural if there's only 1 counter spell on the entire list?
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 hanging out on the sideboard of all places. But I think as a result of Expressive Iteration giving you clean 2-for-1s, you actually need fewer Planeswalkers, and so you can get by with a leaner suite there. Wall of Omens can chump Protected Teferi Time Rattler for a turn or 2 while it lets you cast an Instant Speed Supreme Verdict. You got to play 4 Prismatic Ending, 4 Lightning Bolt as clean answers to early drops. And you get to play a pretty flexible set of sideboard cards. One benefit, of course, of going to Rest in Peace main deck is that if you're trying to attack graveyard decks out of the sideboard, what usually happens is you just get crushed game 1. You just can't beat Living End. They just cycle, and all of a sudden you're facing out 20 power as your battlefield gets the other direction of Living End. And so to make up for that, you have to come out strong in the sideboard games, which means you to have like 4 Rest in Pieces or whatever. But if you're playing the main deck, you actually will win game 1, some of the time just because you drew your Rest in Peace at the right time. And so as a result, you don't need to have as much game equity focused on games 2 and 3, which frees up your sideboard for cards like Wear and Tear, Chalice of the Void, Alpine Moon, counterspells for the whatever control matchups or whatever. Stony Silence, Void Mirror, just like a bunch of one-ofs that I think are randomly good against, together can give you a good package against a lot of decks. But yeah, this is a very one-of heavy list. Is that where you typically want to be with control decks? Not quite so much like this. Maybe. I mean, Expressive Iteration is really good at digging. It's basically like you're playing 4 Ponders. Obviously, it's not quite as fast as that, but if you play it on turn 3, you can find a Chalice of the Void or an Alpine Moon off of it. You can find a Tear out of the sideboard. So it does let the deck dig pretty fast, pretty early.
It does seem like if there's a broken card in this deck, it is Expressive Iteration. People who play this card in pretty much every format say this card is cracked, this card is way too good. All you have to do is just like find a land in your top 3 and you've got a clean 2 for 1. And if you don't have a land, all you have to do is find a 1-drop, you get a clean 2 for 1. And if somehow all that didn't come together, it failed, you still got a 1 for 1. It's extremely generous, and ironically, I think the designer, maybe Andrew Brown, said he was advocating for this to look at this top 4 card.